Welcome to Indigenous Love Stories. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's begin today's story. The dust devil spiraled across the endless expanse of prairie grass, carrying with it the whispered secrets of a land that had witnessed countless journeys, countless farewells, and countless souls seeking redemption beneath the vast Montana sky. The late afternoon sun hung like a copper medallion against the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched toward the distant mountains where snow-capped peaks pierced the heavens like ancient spears thrust upward by the earth itself. Along the weathered trail that connected the scattered settlements of the territory, a solitary figure moved with the fluid grace of one born to read the language of wind and stone. The tribal warrior's moccasined feet made no sound against the packed earth, his presence as natural as the sagebrush that dotted the landscape and as enduring as the granite formations that had stood sentinel over these lands since time immemorial. His long black hair, adorned with eagle feathers that caught the dying light, flowed behind him like a banner of his heritage, while the intricate beadwork on his buckskin shirt told stories of hunts, of ceremonies, of a people who understood that every living thing possessed a spirit worthy of respect. His dark eyes, sharp as obsidian and deep as mountain lakes, scanned the path ahead with the practiced awareness of one who had learned to read danger in the flight patterns of birds and safety in the way grass bent before the wind. The leather pouch at his side contained sacred herbs and healing roots, tools of a medicine man who had chosen to walk between worlds, serving not only his own people, but any soul in need of guidance or protection. The tomahawk at his belt remained untouched, for this was a man who preferred to heal rather than harm, to build bridges rather than burn them. It was then that his keen gaze fell upon something that made his steady stride falter for the first time in many miles. There, beside a cluster of wild roses that had somehow found purchase in the harsh soil, lay a small form that seemed as fragile as a bird fallen from its nest. The child could not have seen more than 8 summers, her slight frame wrapped in a tattered dress that had once been blue, but now bore the stains of countless days spent beneath the unforgiving sun and the cold embrace of prairie nights. Her auburn hair, matted with dust and tangled with burrs, spread around her head like a halo touched by fire. Even in sleep, her face bore the gaunt hollows of hunger and the pale complexion of one who had known too little shelter and too much sorrow. Her small hands, scratched and dirt-stained, clutched a wooden doll whose painted face had been worn smooth by countless embraces, the only companion that had remained faithful through whatever tragedy had brought her to this desolate place. The warrior approached with the reverence one might show when entering a sacred grove, his movements deliberate and gentle. He knelt beside the sleeping child, noting the way her breathing came in shallow, exhausted rhythms, and how her body instinctively curled inward, as if trying to protect itself from a world that had shown her little kindness. The roses beside her seemed to lean protectively over her small form, their thorns creating a natural barrier, while their sweet fragrance provided the only comfort this harsh landscape could offer. As he studied her peaceful face, the warrior saw beyond the dirt and exhaustion to the spirit that dwelled within. Here was a soul that had endured trials that would have broken many adults, yet something in her expression spoke of an inner strength that had not been extinguished. Perhaps it was the way her fingers maintained their gentle grip on the wooden doll, or the slight upturn at the corners of her mouth that suggested dreams of better days. But he recognized in her the same resilience that had carried his own people through generations of hardship. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of approaching storm clouds that gathered like dark prophecies along the northern horizon. Soon, the prairie would be lashed by rain and possibly hail, and the temperature would drop with the merciless swiftness that characterized this untamed land. No child could survive such exposure, especially one already weakened by days or perhaps weeks of wandering alone. The warrior reached into his medicine pouch and withdrew a small bundle of sweetgrass, lighting it with practiced movements and allowing the sacred smoke to drift over the sleeping child. The ritual was both blessing and promise, an acknowledgement that their paths had crossed not by chance, but by the design of forces greater than either of them could comprehend. As the smoke curled upward toward the darkening sky, he made a silent vow that would change both their destinies forever. The child's eyelids fluttered like butterfly wings against the morning light, consciousness returning slowly, as if her spirit had traveled great distances during the night and needed time to find its way back to her small body. The first sensation that greeted her awakening was warmth, not the harsh, burning heat of the prairie sun that had been her tormentor for so many days, but the gentle, enveloping warmth of a carefully tended fire and soft buffalo hide that had been wrapped around her with the tenderness of a mother's embrace. Her green eyes, the color of new spring grass after rain, opened wide with the startled alertness of a deer sensing movement in the forest. The world around her had transformed during her sleep. Where once there had been only the endless expanse of dusty trail and thorny brush, now she found herself in a small shelter, woven from willow branches and covered with hides that bore the intricate paintings of eagles soaring over mountain peaks. The air was filled with the comforting aroma of sage and cedar, mixed with the rich scent of rabbit stew that simmered in a clay pot suspended over glowing coals. The tribal warrior sat cross-legged on the opposite side of the fire, his presence as steady and reassuring as the ancient oak trees that dotted the river valleys of his homeland. His hands worked with practiced precision as he carved symbols into a piece of smooth river stone, each mark deliberate and meaningful, part of a language older than the settlements that had begun to spring up across the territory. The rhythmic scraping of his knife against stone created a gentle percussion that seemed to harmonize with the crackling of the fire and the distant call of meadowlarks greeting the dawn. The child's fingers instinctively sought her wooden doll, and relief flooded her features when she found it nestled safely beside her, its familiar weight unchanged despite all the strangeness of her new surroundings. The doll's painted blue eyes seemed to reflect her own wonder and uncertainty, a silent companion that had witnessed her journey from whatever tragedy had set her wandering alone across the vast prairie. The warrior had positioned it carefully within her reach, understanding without words the importance of this simple toy to a heart that had lost so much. As awareness fully returned, the child became conscious of other changes that spoke of careful attention during her hours of exhausted sleep. Her tangled hair had been gently combed and braided with small wildflowers woven between the strands, transforming her from a bedraggled waif into something resembling the prairie princesses from the stories her grandmother had once told. Her torn dress had been mended with sinew and decorated with small beads that caught the firelight like captured stars. Most remarkably, the constant gnawing hunger that had been her companion for so long had been replaced by the satisfied fullness of a belly that had been fed with warm broth and honey cakes while she slept. The warrior's dark eyes met hers across the fire, and in that moment of connection, something profound passed between them that transcended the barriers of language and culture. His gaze held no threat, no demand for explanation or gratitude, only the patient acceptance of one who understood that trust must be earned through actions rather than words. He had seen the wariness in her expression, the instinctive tension that spoke of encounters with those who might have shown her kindness only to demand payment she was too young to understand or give. Slowly, deliberately, the warrior set aside his carving and reached into a leather pouch at his side. From it, he withdrew a small object that made the child's breath catch in her throat, a wooden horse, carved with the same skilled hands that had created the symbols on the stone, its mane flowing as if caught in an eternal wind. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each detail lovingly rendered, from the proud arch of its neck to the powerful muscles that seemed ready to carry its rider across endless plains toward adventure and freedom. He placed the horse on the ground between them, then retreated to his previous position, making it clear that the gift was offered freely, with no expectation of approach or acceptance. The gesture spoke of understanding that went beyond his years of walking between the world of his people and the world of the settlers who had begun to reshape the landscape. He had learned to read the language of wounded spirits, to recognize the signs of trauma that could make even the gentlest gesture seem threatening to one who had learned to associate human contact with pain or loss. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the shelter walls with shifting patterns of gold and amber light that danced like the spirits his grandmother had told him lived in all beautiful things. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, but within this small sanctuary time seemed suspended, allowing two souls from different worlds to begin the delicate process of building the foundation upon which trust could grow. The wooden horse remained untouched between them for the better part of the morning, a bridge waiting to be crossed when courage finally overcame caution. The child's eyes returned to it repeatedly, drawn by its beauty and the promise it represented, Yet her small hands stayed firmly wrapped around her familiar doll, clinging to the one constant in a world that had proven itself capable of shattering without warning. The warrior continued his patient vigil, understanding that healing, like the changing of seasons, could not be rushed but must unfold according to its own natural rhythm. As the sun reached its zenith, casting short shadows that pooled like dark water around the base of the shelter, the child's stomach announced its needs with a soft rumble that brought the faintest hint of color to her pale cheeks. The warrior rose with fluid grace, moving to tend the fire and the pot that hung above it. His movements were economical and purposeful, each gesture speaking of a lifetime spent in harmony with the natural world, where waste was not merely foolish, but potentially fatal. From a parfleche bag decorated with geometric patterns in red and yellow ochre, he withdrew strips of dried meat and wild berries that had been preserved in fat and formed into small cakes. These he arranged on a piece of clean bark, creating a meal that was both nourishing and beautiful. The colors and textures arranged with the same artistic sensibility that guided his carving and beadwork. The presentation was important, he knew, for one who had perhaps grown accustomed to scraps and leavings, needed to be reminded that she was worthy of care and consideration. The aroma of the food seemed to work a gentle magic, and gradually the child's grip on her doll loosened. She shifted position slightly, no longer curled into the tight ball of self-protection that had characterized her posture since awakening. Her green eyes, which had held the wariness of a wild creature ready to bolt at the first sign of danger, began to show flickers of curiosity about her surroundings and the man who had created this sanctuary in the wilderness. The warrior noticed these subtle changes with the same attention he paid to the shifting of wind patterns or the behavior of animals before a storm. Each small sign of relaxation was noted and treasured, evidence that the healing process had begun. He had learned from the medicine women of his tribe that the spirit often required more tending than the body, and that patience was the most powerful medicine of all. As the afternoon progressed, the child began to explore her immediate surroundings with tentative movements, always keeping the warrior in sight but gradually expanding the circle of her investigation. She discovered that the shelter was larger than it had first appeared, with alcoves that held carefully arranged bundles of herbs, tools crafted from bone and stone, and objects whose purpose she could not fathom, but which spoke of a life lived with intention and reverence for the sacred in everyday things. In one corner, she found a collection of stones, each one smooth and perfectly shaped, arranged in patterns that seemed to tell stories without words. Some were painted with symbols that reminded her of the tracks animals left in mud after rain, while others bore images of the sun, moon, and stars that wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. The child's fingers hovered over these treasures, wanting to touch but uncertain whether such beauty was meant for hands like hers. The warrior observed her fascination with the stones and slowly approached, carrying one that had not been part of the display. This stone was different from the others, plain and unpainted, its surface smooth but unmarked, full of potential waiting to be realized. He placed it near the wooden horse, creating a small collection of gifts that spoke not of charity, but of welcome, of a place being prepared for one who belonged. As evening approached and the light began to take on the golden quality that transformed the prairie into something magical, the child made her first tentative move toward acceptance. Her small hand reached out, not for the food or the painted stones, but for the wooden horse that had waited so patiently for her attention. Her fingers traced its carved mane with wonder, feeling the smoothness of wood that had been shaped with love and skill. The moment her hand closed around the horse, something shifted in the atmosphere of the shelter. The warrior felt it as surely as he felt changes in barometric pressure before a storm, a loosening of tension, a softening of the barriers that fear and trauma had erected around the child's heart. She lifted the horse and held it close to her chest, next to her doll, and for the first time since awakening, her lips curved in the ghost of a smile. The prairie wind whispered through the shelter walls, carrying with it the scents of sage and sweetgrass, of distant rain and the promise of cooler temperatures as night approached. But within their small sanctuary, warmth prevailed. Not just the physical warmth of the fire, but the deeper warmth that comes when two souls recognize in each other the possibility of family, of belonging, of home. The fourth dawn brought with it a transformation that seemed to emerge from the very earth itself. The child, who had spent 3 days learning to trust the rhythm of safety that surrounded her, awakened not with the startled alertness of prey, but with the gentle stirring of one who knew herself to be protected. Her small fingers still clutched both the wooden horse and her faithful doll, but now they rested easily in her grasp, rather than being held with the desperate grip of one afraid of losing everything precious. The warrior had risen before the sun, as was his custom, and had spent the pre-dawn hours in meditation and prayer, offering tobacco to the four directions and asking for guidance in the delicate work of healing that lay before him. The spirits had whispered to him in the language of wind through grass and the distant cry of hawks circling overhead, confirming what his heart already knew, that this child had been brought to him not by chance, but by the same forces that guided the migration of buffalo and the turning of seasons. When the child emerged from the shelter, she found him tending a small garden that she had not noticed before, hidden as it was behind a natural windbreak of sage and wild rose bushes. Here, in defiance of the harsh prairie environment, grew plants that spoke of careful cultivation and deep knowledge of the earth's secrets. Corn stalks reached toward the sky with the determination of prayers made manifest, while squash vines spread their broad leaves like protective hands over the dark soil. Bean plants climbed wooden poles with the same graceful spiraling motion that characterized the smoke from sacred fires. The sight of this hidden oasis filled the child with wonder that transcended her previous experiences, of a world that seemed designed to take rather than give. Here was evidence that the earth could be coaxed into abundance through patience and understanding, that life could flourish even in places where survival seemed impossible. The warrior's hands moved among the plants, with the same reverence he showed when handling his medicine bundles, each touch deliberate and respectful. As the morning progressed, the child found herself drawn into the rhythm of tending that defined the warrior's relationship with his environment. Without being asked or instructed, she began to help in small ways, carrying water in a gourd bowl, removing stones from the pathways between plants, sitting quietly nearby as he worked. Her presence seemed to bring its own blessing to the garden, as if the plants themselves recognized the purity of spirit that dwelt within her small frame. The warrior observed these developments with the satisfaction of one who had planted seeds and now watched them take root. He had learned from his grandmother that healing often began not with grand gestures, but with the simple act of being useful, of contributing to something larger than oneself. The child's willingness to help spoke of a spirit that had not been broken by whatever trials had brought her to that dusty road, but had instead been refined like silver in fire. By midday, when the sun hung directly overhead and cast no shadows, the child had begun to exhibit behaviors that spoke of growing security. She ventured farther from the immediate vicinity of the shelter, always keeping the warrior in sight, but exploring with the natural curiosity that had been suppressed by fear and necessity. She discovered a small creek that meandered through a grove of cottonwood trees, its water clear and cold from mountain springs that fed it dozens of miles upstream. At the water's edge, she knelt and cupped the precious liquid in her hands, drinking deeply and then splashing her face with the joy of one who had learned not to take such abundance for granted. The wooden horse accompanied her on these explorations, sometimes held carefully in her arms, sometimes placed on rocks or fallen logs, as if it too needed to see the wonders of this sanctuary that had become their world. The afternoon brought clouds that promised relief from the heat, and with them came a sense of completion that seemed to settle over the small community of two like a blessing. The child had eaten without coaxing, had helped without being asked, and had begun to show the first tentative signs of the laughter that had once been as natural to her as breathing. The warrior recognized these signs as surely as he recognized the approach of rain in the behavior of birds and the smell of the wind. The fifth morning arrived with an unsettling stillness that made the warrior's instincts sharpen like a blade being honed against stone. The usual symphony of prairie sounds, the rustle of grass in the wind, the distant calls of meadowlarks, the gentle murmur of the creek, had been replaced by an ominous quiet that spoke of disturbance in the natural order. Even the child Hugh, who had grown accustomed to greeting each dawn with increasing confidence, seemed to sense the change, staying closer to the shelter and casting frequent glances toward the horizon, where dust clouds gathered like storm warnings. The warrior's trained eyes read the signs that others might have missed or dismissed. The way the horses of distant riders moved spoke of urgency rather than casual travel, their gait suggesting men who rode with purpose and little regard for the welfare of their mounts. The direction of their approach, following the same trail where he had found the child, suggested they were tracking something or someone. His hand moved instinctively to the medicine bundle at his side, fingers tracing the familiar contours of objects that had protected his people for generations. Throughout the morning, the child remained unusually quiet, her small hands clutching both the wooden horse and her doll with renewed intensity. The progress she had made in recent days seemed to retreat like morning mist before the sun, replaced by the hypervigilance of one who had learned that safety could be an illusion that shattered without warning. Her green eyes, which had begun to show sparks of joy and curiosity, now held the haunted quality of someone much older than her years. The warrior understood that her reaction was not mere coincidence, but the wisdom of instinct that had kept her alive during whatever ordeal had brought her to his path. Children, he knew, often possessed an awareness that adults had learned to ignore, a sensitivity to danger that civilization had not yet dulled. He watched her carefully, noting how she positioned herself near escape routes and how her breathing had become shallow and controlled, as if she were preparing to become invisible. As the sun reached its zenith, the source of the disturbance became clear. 3 riders crested the distant ridge, their silhouettes dark against the bright sky like harbingers of a storm that had been building beyond the horizon. Even at this distance, the warrior could read their intentions in the way they sat their horses, the aggressive angle of their bodies, the methodical way they scanned the landscape. These were not travelers seeking shelter or traders looking for commerce, but men who hunted with the persistence of wolves and the cruelty of those who had forgotten that other beings possessed souls worthy of respect. The child's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her face drained of color until it resembled the pale stones found in dried creek beds, and her entire body began to tremble with a fear so profound it seemed to emanate from her very bones. The wooden horse fell from nerveless fingers as she pressed herself against the shelter wall, trying to become one with the shadows that offered the only protection she could imagine. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, the kind of panic that preceded complete collapse. The warrior moved with the fluid grace of one accustomed to crisis, positioning himself between the child and the approaching threat while maintaining the appearance of casual activity. His hands continued their work of tending the fire, but every sense was focused on the riders who drew steadily closer. He had faced such men before, had learned to recognize the particular brand of evil that wore human faces while harboring hearts as cold as winter stones. The afternoon air grew heavy with tension as the riders approached the outer boundaries of the sanctuary he had created. Their horses' hooves raised small clouds of dust that seemed to carry with them the scent of violence and desperation. The warrior could see now that they were well-armed and travel-worn, men who had been riding hard for days, with the single-minded determination of those who would not be deterred by obstacles or appeals to mercy. The child had begun to make small wounded sounds that spoke of memories too terrible to voice. Her small body curled into the tightest ball possible, as if she could somehow disappear entirely. The warrior's heart filled with a protective fury that burned as bright and clean as sacred fire, a rage that was not born of hatred but of love for the innocent and defenseless. The moment of confrontation approached like a thunderstorm gathering strength, and the warrior prepared himself for whatever trial lay ahead. The 3 riders approached with the calculated menace of predators who had grown accustomed to finding their prey defenseless and alone. Their leader, a man whose face bore the weathered cruelty of one who had spent years taking what he wanted without consequence, dismounted with the arrogant confidence of someone who had never encountered true resistance. His companions remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their weapons, eyes scanning the area with the practiced assessment of those who made their living through intimidation and violence. The warrior rose from his position by the fire with movements that appeared unhurried, but carried within them the coiled potential of a mountain cat, preparing to defend its territory. His dark eyes met those of the intruders, with a steady gaze that spoke of depths they could not fathom, and strengths they had not anticipated. The eagle feathers in his hair caught the afternoon light, transforming him from a simple man tending his camp into something that seemed to embody the very spirit of the untamed land itself. Behind him, the child had become as still as stone, her terror so complete that it seemed to have frozen her very breath. Yet the warrior's presence between her and the approaching threat created a barrier that was more than physical. It was a wall built from determination and sacred purpose that no amount of worldly power could breach. The wooden horse lay forgotten in the dust, but the child's doll remained pressed against her chest, like a talisman against the darkness that had found her once again. The leader of the riders began to speak, his words carrying the false reasonableness of one accustomed to getting his way through a combination of threats and hollow promises. His tone suggested that he considered the warrior merely an obstacle to be removed or circumvented, a simple savage who could be intimidated or bought with trinkets and empty assurances. The arrogance in his voice revealed a man who had never learned to recognize true strength when it stood before him. The warrior listened without responding, his silence more powerful than any words could have been. His stillness was not the paralysis of fear, but the perfect balance of one who had learned to find his center in the midst of chaos. Every fiber of his being was attuned to the subtle shifts in the wind, the nervous movements of the horses, the way shadows fell across the ground, all the signs that would tell him when words would give way to action. As the confrontation continued, something remarkable began to happen. The very land itself seemed to respond to the presence of evil in its midst. The wind, which had been still all morning, began to stir, carrying with it the scent of sage and sweetgrass that spoke of sacred spaces and ancient protections. The horses of the intruders grew restless, their ears flicking nervously as if they sensed something their riders could not perceive. The warrior's hand moved slowly to the medicine bundle at his side, not as a gesture of aggression, but as a connection to powers that transcended the crude violence these men represented. The bundle contained not weapons but sacred objects, stones that had been blessed by generations of holy men, herbs that carried the prayers of his ancestors, symbols that linked him to the eternal cycle of protection and renewal that governed all life. The leader's voice grew more insistent, his words revealing the true nature of his mission and the depths of depravity that had driven him to pursue a defenseless child across hundreds of miles of wilderness. His companions shifted in their saddles, their initial confidence beginning to waver as they realized that this confrontation was not unfolding according to their expectations. The warrior's calm presence seemed to drain the power from their threats, leaving them feeling exposed and uncertain. Behind the wall of protection that the warrior's presence created, the child began to experience something she had not felt since her ordeal began. The possibility that evil might not always triumph, that there existed in the world forces capable of standing against the darkness that had pursued her. Her breathing began to slow, and though she remained motionless, a spark of hope flickered to life in her green eyes. The afternoon sun continued its journey across the sky, but time seemed suspended in this moment of confrontation between two fundamentally different ways of being in the world. On one side stood those who took what they wanted through force and cruelty, and on the other stood one who understood that true strength came from connection to something greater than oneself. The confrontation reached its crescendo not through violence, but through a demonstration of power that transcended the crude understanding of the three intruders. The warrior's connection to the sacred forces of the land began to manifest in ways that defied the limited worldview of men who knew only the language of threats and brutality. The wind that had begun as a gentle stirring grew stronger, carrying with it not just the scent of sage but something deeper, the very breath of the ancestors who had walked this land for countless generations. The horses of the intruders became increasingly agitated, their eyes rolling white with a fear that their riders could not comprehend. These animals, closer to the natural world than their human masters, sensed the presence of something that commanded respect and inspired awe. They began to sidestep and rear, their nervous energy creating a chaos that disrupted the carefully planned intimidation their riders had intended to project. The leader of the group found his confidence wavering as he looked into the warrior's eyes and saw reflected there not the submission he expected, but a depth of purpose that seemed to draw its strength from the very mountains that rose in the distance. The man's words, which had flowed so easily when he believed himself to be in control, began to falter as he realized that he faced something beyond his experience or understanding. The warrior remained motionless, his presence growing more commanding with each passing moment. The eagle feathers in his hair seemed to catch every breath of wind, moving with a life of their own that spoke of connections to the sky spirits and the great birds that soared between earth and heaven. His medicine bundle pulsed with an energy that was felt rather than seen, a warmth that spread outward like ripples on still water. Behind him, the child felt the change in the atmosphere as surely as she would have felt the approach of dawn after the longest night. The terror that had paralyzed her began to give way to something she had almost forgotten existed, the possibility of protection of safety, of belonging to something stronger than the forces that had pursued her. Her small hand crept forward and closed around the wooden horse that had fallen in the dust, drawing strength from its familiar weight. The transformation in the confrontation became complete when the very earth seemed to respond to the warrior's silent call. A golden eagle appeared overhead, its cry piercing the afternoon air with a sound that spoke of freedom and untamed power. The great bird circled once, twice, 3 times above the small gathering, its shadow passing over the intruders like a judgment rendered by forces they could neither understand nor challenge. The effect on the 3 men was immediate and profound. Their horses, already nervous, became unmanageable as the eagle's presence triggered instincts older than civilization. The animals wheeled and plunged, forcing their riders to concentrate on staying mounted rather than pursuing their original purpose. The leader's face, which had been flushed with arrogant confidence, now showed the pallor of one who had glimpsed something that challenged everything he believed about power and control. As the eagle continued its majestic circles overhead, other signs began to manifest. The wind carried sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the distant thunder of buffalo hooves, the whispered prayers of generations, the eternal song of the land itself. These were not sounds that could be heard with ears alone, but vibrations that resonated in the soul, speaking of connections that bound all living things in an unbreakable web of mutual dependence and respect. The warrior's silent victory was complete when the leader of the intruders, his face now showing the first cracks in his facade of cruel confidence, began to back away. His companions, struggling to control their terrified mounts, needed no encouragement to follow his retreat. The horses, given their head, turned and fled with the speed of creatures escaping a predator they could sense but not see. As the dust of their departure settled, the eagle gave one final cry and soared away toward the mountains, its message delivered and its purpose fulfilled. The warrior remained standing until the last echo of hoofbeats faded into the distance, his vigil maintained until he was certain that the threat had truly passed. The child, still clutching her wooden horse, looked up at her protector with eyes that held a new understanding. She had witnessed something that would remain with her for the rest of her life, the knowledge that there existed in the world forces of good as powerful as any evil, and that sometimes, when the need was greatest, those forces would manifest to protect the innocent. The 8th dawn broke over the prairie with a clarity that seemed to wash the very air clean, as if the confrontation of the previous day had purged something dark from the atmosphere and left behind only the pure light of possibility. The child awakened not with the gradual stirring that had characterized her recent mornings, but with the bright alertness of one who had passed through a great trial and emerged transformed. Her green eyes, which had held so much fear and uncertainty, now sparkled with something that had been absent for too long, the simple joy of being alive and safe. The warrior sat by the fire, working on a new project that had occupied his hands since before sunrise. In his skilled fingers, a second wooden horse was taking shape, this one slightly larger than the first, its mane carved to flow, as if caught in an eternal wind of freedom. The child watched his work with fascination, no longer the passive observer she had been, but an active participant in the rhythm of their shared life. As the morning progressed, she began to help with the daily tasks that maintained their small sanctuary. Her movements had lost the hesitant quality that had marked her first days of recovery, replaced by the confident grace of one who knew herself to be valued and wanted. She carried water from the creek without being asked, tended the fire with careful attention, and helped gather the wild berries that grew in abundance near their shelter. The garden that had seemed so miraculous to her just days before now felt like a natural extension of their home, a place where she belonged as surely as the corn and squash that reached toward the sun. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when plants needed water or when insects threatened the tender shoots, developing an intuitive understanding that pleased the warrior more than any words of gratitude could have done. By midday, when the sun hung directly overhead and cast the shortest shadows, the warrior had completed his carving. The second horse stood beside the first, and together they seemed to represent something greater than the sum of their parts, a family, a herd, a symbol of the bonds that could form between souls who had found each other across the vast loneliness of the world. The child approached the horses with reverence, understanding without being told that this was a moment of significance. When the warrior gestured for her to take both figures, she cradled them against her chest alongside her faithful doll, creating a collection of treasures that spoke of past, present, and future, woven together in an unbreakable tapestry. The afternoon brought visitors of a different sort than those who had threatened their peace. A family of deer emerged from the cottonwood grove, their graceful forms moving with the fluid beauty that characterized all wild things in their natural state. They showed no fear of the warrior or the child, approaching close enough that their dark eyes could be seen clearly, their presence a blessing and a sign that the sanctuary they had created was recognized and approved by the spirits of the land. As evening approached and the light began to take on the golden quality that transformed the ordinary world into something magical, the child made a discovery that filled her heart with wonder. In the place where she had first been found, where the wild roses had seemed to lean protectively over her sleeping form, new buds had appeared overnight. These flowers, impossibly beautiful and fragrant, seemed to have bloomed in celebration of her transformation from lost waif to beloved daughter. The warrior watched as she knelt among the roses, her small hands gentle as she touched the petals that seemed to glow within a light. In that moment, he knew that his promise had been fulfilled completely. The child who had been alone and afraid now belonged to something larger than herself, part of a family that transcended blood and tradition to embrace the deeper bonds of choice and love. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the eternal song of home. Thank you for joining us for another Indigenous Love Stories journey. If this story made your heart beat a little faster, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments which part touched you the most. Every gesture helps carry these tales of love, courage, and hope even further. Until our next ride.